My name is Avery Collins, and until that night, I believed my marriage was steady, quiet, and safe. Daniel Brooks had a way of making everything feel predictable. After 8 years together in Seattle, we had settled into routines that felt almost comforting in their simplicity. He ran a successful real estate development firm. I owned a small but growing interior design studio that focused on residential renovations. Our lives weren't extravagant, but they were stable. Stable enough that I never imagined the ground beneath me could shift overnight. Daniel handled most of our finances, not because I couldn't, but because he always insisted it made things easier. He understood investments, taxes, property structures. I understood color palettes, architectural balance, and how to turn empty rooms into homes people wanted to live in. It seemed like a fair division. Every evening, we ate dinner at the small oak table near the kitchen window. Every Sunday morning, we walked along Lake Washington with coffee in hand. Daniel liked routine. He said it made life calmer. I believed him. That Tuesday night, late March, still cold enough that the rain tapped steadily against our bedroom windows. I woke up to an empty bed. At first, it didn't seem strange. Daniel sometimes stayed up late reviewing property proposals or speaking with investors in different time zones. His home office was downstairs near the living room, and the faint glow of light usually slipped under the door when he was working late. I rolled over, pulling the blanket higher around my shoulders, ready to fall back asleep. Then I heard his voice, low, careful, different from the easy tone he used with me. "She won't see it coming," he said. My eyes opened immediately. The words were quiet, but the house was silent enough that they carried up the staircase. I held my breath. A few seconds passed before he spoke again. "Everything's lined up already," Daniel continued. "Once the papers are filed, it'll be too late for her to do anything about it." My chest tightened. For a moment, I wondered if I had misunderstood. Maybe he was talking about a business partner, a property dispute, something unrelated to us. But then he said something that erased every other possibility. "She trusts me with everything." The sentence landed like cold water. I sat up slowly in the dark. The rain outside seemed louder now, tapping against the glass in uneven bursts. My heart began beating so hard that I could hear it in my ears. Daniel's office door creaked faintly downstairs. I slipped quietly out of bed and stepped into the hallway, careful not to let the floorboards make a sound. From the top of the staircase, I could see the thin strip of light under the office door. Daniel's voice continued, still low and controlled. "No," he said. "She has no idea. And by the time she realizes what's happening, it'll already be done." I stood there frozen, gripping the railing. My husband was planning something. And somehow, whatever it was about me. I didn't move closer. I didn't open the door. I didn't confront him. Instead, I turned and walked quietly back to the bedroom. A few minutes later, I heard his footsteps on the stairs. The mattress shifted as he slipped back into bed beside me. His arm rested lightly over the blanket. "You still awake?" he murmured. I kept my breathing slow and steady, pretending to sleep, because in that moment I understood something I had never considered before. The man lying next to me was hiding a plan, and somehow that plan ended with me losing everything. Morning came quietly the way it always did in our house. Seattle's gray light filtered through the kitchen windows while the coffee maker hummed on the counter. Rain still clung to the glass outside, leaving thin trails that slid slowly downward. Daniel sat at the kitchen island reading emails on his laptop, dressed in one of his tailored navy suits. To anyone looking in from the outside, nothing had changed. "Morning," he said casually as I stepped into the kitchen. His voice sounded exactly the same as it always had. Calm, familiar, almost comforting. I forced a small smile and poured myself coffee. "Morning." He didn't look up from the screen. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined everything the night before, if exhaustion or half-sleep had twisted what I heard into something darker than it really was. But then I remembered his words. "She won't see it coming." I wrapped both hands around my mug to steady them. Daniel closed his laptop and grabbed his car keys. "Long day today," he said. "Meeting with investors downtown." He kissed the top of my head the way he always did before leaving. The gesture was so normal that it made my chest tighten. "See you tonight," he said, already heading toward the door. A moment later, I heard the garage door open and the sound of his car pulling away. The house fell silent. I stood there for several minutes, staring at the empty kitchen before finally walking into the small home office we shared. A stack of folders sat on the corner of the desk. Household paperwork. Daniel usually handled tax documents, property statements, bank summaries. I had never paid much attention to them, not because I didn't care, but because Daniel had always been confident about managing that part of our life. Numbers and contracts were his language. My world was fabrics, floor plans, and clients who wanted their homes redesigned. But that morning, something felt different. I opened the top folder slowly. Inside were printed bank statements and investment summaries from the last few months. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Mortgage payments, property taxes, routine transfers between accounts. Then I started noticing something else: small adjustments, a joint savings account that had slowly decreased over several months, investment allocations that had shifted without any discussion between us, property documents where Daniel's name appeared in slightly different ownership structures than before. None of it looked dramatic on its own, but together it formed a pattern I had never bothered to see. I sat down at the desk and scrolled through the online account summaries on my laptop. The numbers weren't alarming, but they told a quiet story. Daniel had been reorganizing things, gradually, carefully. My stomach tightened as another memory surfaced. Several times over the past year, I had asked casual questions about our investments. Daniel would smile and say something like, "Don't worry about that, I've got it handled." And I had always believed him, not because he demanded it, because I trusted him. The realization settled slowly into place. Daniel had always managed our finances, the properties, the investment accounts, the retirement funds. I had signed documents when he asked, glanced over statements when they arrived, but the real control had always been in his hands. At the time, it felt like partnership. Now, sitting alone in that quiet room, it felt like something else entirely. I closed the folder and leaned back in the chair. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. But inside the house, a new kind of silence had taken its place. For the first time since hearing Daniel's late-night conversation, a question began forming clearly in my mind. If my husband was planning something that would leave me with nothing, how much of my life was already out of my control? By Thursday afternoon, the house felt different. Nothing had actually changed. The same quiet rooms, the same framed photos along the hallway, the same stack of design samples spread across my studio desk. But something inside me had shifted. For 2 days I had carried the weight of what I overheard without saying a word. I watched Daniel move through our routines as if nothing was wrong. He left early for work, returned late, kissed me goodnight, and talked about real estate deals the way he always did. And each time he spoke, a part of me wondered how much of it was real. I kept remembering the conversation from Tuesday night. "She won't see it coming." The words replayed in my mind like a quiet echo. By Thursday morning, I understood something clearly. I couldn't figure this out alone, not because I lacked intelligence, but because Daniel's world, contracts, investment structures, tax strategies, was a language I had never fully learned. There was only one person I trusted to translate it: Marcus Hale. Marcus had known my family for years. He was in his mid-40s now, a financial planner based in Portland who specialized in helping small business owners structure long-term investments. When my design studio first started growing, he had helped me set up a retirement account and a basic financial plan. We hadn't spoken much in the past year, but I knew one thing about Marcus. He was careful, and he was honest. I called him that afternoon from my office. "Marcus, it's Avery Collins," I said when he answered. There was a brief pause before his warm voice came through the line. "Avery, it's been a while. Everything okay?" For a moment, I almost said yes. Almost told him it was just a routine question, but something inside me stopped pretending. I'm not sure, I admitted. I didn't tell him everything, not yet. The words still felt too heavy to say out loud. Instead, I explained that I wanted someone to review my personal financial structure, my design firm income, my savings, and anything tied directly to my work. Marcus listened carefully. Are you asking for a second opinion, he said slowly, or are you worried about something specific? I hesitated. Maybe both. There was another pause. Then Marcus said something that made my chest tighten. If you're asking that question, Avery, there's usually a reason. We scheduled a meeting for Saturday morning at a quiet cafe in Tacoma, halfway between Seattle and Portland. I chose the location deliberately. Daniel rarely traveled that direction. That evening, as I drove home from the studio, the sky over Seattle was streaked with the pale orange light of sunset. Traffic moved slowly along Interstate 5, the usual rush hour crawl. My mind replayed the bank statements from the day before, the shifting accounts, the gradual changes in ownership structures. Individually, they meant very little, but together they felt like the outline of something larger, something I still couldn't see clearly. When I walked into the house, Daniel was already home. He stood in the kitchen pouring himself a glass of wine, his jacket draped over the back of a chair. Hey, he said casually. Long day, busy, I replied, setting my bag down. He handed me a glass and leaned against the counter. For a moment, he looked exactly like the man I had married 8 years ago. Relaxed, confident, completely at ease. Anything interesting happened today? He asked. The question lingered between us. I studied his face, searching for any hint that he suspected what I had heard. But there was nothing, just the same calm expression he always wore. I shook my head lightly. Just work. Daniel nodded and lifted his glass. And in that moment, I realized something important. Whatever plan my husband was building, he still believed I knew nothing about it. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of gray sky Seattle was known for. Low clouds hung over the streets, and a thin mist hovered above the sidewalks as people moved quietly between cafes and bookstores. I reached Tacoma just before 9. The cafe Marcus suggested sat on a corner near the waterfront, small and quiet enough that most people seemed to know each other by name. It smelled like roasted coffee beans and warm pastries, the kind of place where conversations stayed private. Marcus Hale was already seated near the window when I walked in. He stood when he saw me, tall and composed, wearing a charcoal coat that looked slightly out of place among the casual weekend crowd. Avery, he said, offering a warm handshake. It had been nearly a year since we last met, but Marcus looked exactly the same, steady, observant, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke. Thanks for meeting me, I said as I sat down. Of course, he replied. You sounded serious on the phone. For a moment, I stared out the window at the harbor water shifting beneath the gray sky. Then I told him everything. Not every detail, but enough. The late-night conversation, the gradual changes in our financial documents, the growing sense that something had been rearranged around me without my knowledge. Marcus didn't interrupt while I spoke. He simply listened, his fingers lightly folded around his coffee mug. When I finished, he leaned back slightly. Okay, he said calmly, let's take this step by step. From his briefcase, he pulled out a notebook and a tablet. First question, he said. Your design firm, Collins Interior Studio, that's legally yours, correct? Yes, I said. I started it before Daniel and I got married. Marcus nodded slowly. And the revenue from your projects goes into a business account under your company. Yes, that's good, he said quietly. He tapped a few notes into his tablet. Here's the thing, Avery Marcus continued. Marriage mixes finances in complicated ways, but not everything automatically becomes shared property, especially if it originated from a business you owned before the marriage. I felt my shoulders tighten slightly. So you're saying some of my assets are still separate? Possibly, he said, but we need to be careful. Marcus pulled a document folder toward him. If someone were planning a divorce strategy, he said thoughtfully, they might try to position themselves so they control the majority of accessible assets before anything becomes official. The words landed heavily between us. It was the first time someone else had said out loud what I had been quietly fearing. Marcus looked at me carefully. Have you signed anything recently that transferred ownership of property or accounts? I thought back through the past year. Daniel had occasionally asked me to sign documents related to refinancing one of his properties or adjusting a joint account. At the time, they seemed routine, I said slowly. Marcus nodded. That's common. He paused for a moment before continuing. But here's the important part. He slid the folder toward me. If your business income, intellectual property, and certain accounts were structured correctly, you still have the ability to protect them before any divorce filing happens. The cafe suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, a ferry horn echoed faintly across the water. You mean move them? I asked. Marcus met my eyes. I mean secure them. He didn't rush the explanation. Instead, he outlined the legal process slowly, how ownership structures could be clarified, how business assets could be separated, and how documentation could ensure that what belonged to my company remained mine. None of it sounded dramatic, just paperwork, but the timing mattered. Once divorce papers are filed, Marcus said carefully, the legal environment changes. Courts start examining every move. He closed the folder, but before that, he gave a small shrug. There's still room to organize things properly. I sat quietly, letting the words settle. For the first time since Tuesday night, a path forward appeared in front of me. Not revenge, not confrontation, just protection. Marcus finished his coffee and stood. If you want to move forward with this, he said we should start soon. I nodded slowly, because somewhere in the back of my mind, I could still hear Daniel's voice from that dark hallway. Once the papers are filed, it'll be too late. As I walked back to my car, the morning mist had started to clear, but something told me the real storm hadn't even started yet. The following Wednesday evening, the sky over Seattle was unusually clear. Spring had begun to push the winter rain aside, leaving the air cool but bright. When I pulled into our driveway just after 6, the house looked exactly the same as it always had, warm light in the windows, the quiet suburban calm of our neighborhood settling in for the night. But something about the stillness felt heavier. For the past 4 days, my life had been divided into 2 separate realities. In one, Daniel and I continued our routines. We ate dinner together. We talked about ordinary things, traffic work, the rising cost of materials for one of his development projects. He moved through the house with the same relaxed confidence he always had. In the other reality, the one no one else could see, I had spent every available hour working with Marcus. Monday and Tuesday had been filled with calls, documents, and careful explanations. Marcus connected me with a legal advisor who specialized in small business asset protection. Together, they walked me through exactly what could still be secured under my name. Nothing dramatic, just paperwork, timing, and precision. We clarified the legal structure of Collins Interior Studio. We separated several business-related accounts tied to my design contracts. We documented ownership of my firm's design portfolio, every project, every digital file, every client contract. It was methodical work, but it felt like building a wall one brick at a time. By Wednesday afternoon, the final documents had been signed. Marcus called to confirm. You did the right thing, he said quietly. Whatever happens next, your business and your independent assets are protected. When the call ended, I sat in my office for several minutes staring at the design boards on the wall. For the first time since Tuesday night, the week before, I felt something close to steady ground beneath my feet. But that calm didn't last long. When I walked into the house that evening, Daniel was already home. He stood near the dining table, still wearing his suit jacket, a thin folder resting under his hand. Avery, he said as I stepped inside. His voice carried a different tone tonight, more controlled, more formal. I set my bag on the counter and glanced at the folder. Everything okay? I asked. Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down, gesturing toward the seat across from him. We need to talk. The words landed with quiet finality. I walked over and sat across from him. For a few seconds, he didn't speak. Instead, he slid the folder slowly across the table. The edge of the paper stopped in front of me. I opened it. Inside were legal documents, divorce papers. My eyes scanned the first page, automatically names filing, language, legal formatting. Daniel folded his hands calmly. I think it's time we both admitted something, he said. I looked up. We've been drifting apart for a while now. His voice sounded practiced, like a statement he had rehearsed before saying it aloud. It's better to handle things cleanly, he continued. No drawn-out arguments, no unnecessary damage. He spoke about the process the way someone might discuss closing a business deal. Orderly, efficient, planned. I closed the folder slowly. Across the table, Daniel watched my face carefully, waiting, expecting shock, expecting confusion, expecting the reaction of someone who had just been blindsided. But inside me, something had already shifted days earlier. I remembered the night in the hallway. I remembered the quiet certainty in his voice. She won't see it coming. The room was silent for a moment. Then Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. There's no reason to make this difficult, he said. We can divide things fairly and move on. Divide things fairly. The words echoed in my mind. Daniel still believed he was holding all the cards. He believed I had signed every document he placed in front of me without question. He believed I had no idea what he had been planning. For the first time since that night, I felt something settle firmly inside my chest. Not anger, clarity. I placed my hands on the table and looked directly at him, because in that moment I understood something that could not be undone. The quiet life I thought I had was already over. The only question left was what I was going to do next. Daniel waited. The dining room felt unusually quiet, the soft ticking of the wall clock the only sound between us. The folder containing the divorce papers still rested on the table exactly where he had placed it. He studied my face carefully as if searching for the reaction he expected. Shock, anger, maybe even panic. Instead, I folded my hands calmly in front of me. You've been planning this for a while, haven't you? I said. Daniel blinked slightly, the first sign that something had shifted. What do you mean? He replied. His voice was controlled, but there was a subtle tightness beneath it. I held his gaze. The paperwork, the accounts, the timing. I tapped the folder lightly. This wasn't a sudden decision. For a moment, Daniel didn't answer. Then he gave a small shrug. Divorces rarely are, he said. People grow apart. It happens. His tone remained measured, but his eyes watched me carefully now. He was adjusting, recalculating. I opened the folder again, flipping through the first few pages slowly. The documents outlined asset division, property evaluations, and projected financial settlements. Daniel had prepared everything neatly, almost too neatly. You're assuming a lot in here, I said quietly. He leaned forward slightly. Like what? I closed the folder again and rested my hand on top of it. Like assuming you have access to everything. For the first time since I walked into the room, Daniel's expression changed. It was subtle, just the faint narrowing of his eyes. What exactly are you saying? He asked. I took a breath, feeling the weight of the past week settle into this single moment. I'm saying, I replied evenly, that the structure of my business and my independent assets changed earlier this week. The words hung in the air. Daniel's brow furrowed. What does that mean? It means Collins Interior Studio is now legally protected under its own structure, I said. Its income, its contracts, and its intellectual property are separate. Daniel sat back in his chair. That's not possible, he said immediately. His answer came too quickly. It is, I replied. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him of anything. I simply continued. The paperwork was finalized on Wednesday afternoon. The silence that followed was different from the one earlier. This time it carried tension. Daniel stared at me, processing the information piece by piece. You moved assets, he said slowly. I secured what already belonged to my company. That's the same thing. No, I said quietly. It isn't. His jaw tightened. You can't just do that right before a divorce, he said. I met his eyes calmly. I did it before you filed. The sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water. For the first time that evening, Daniel looked uncertain, not defeated, but unsettled. You had no reason to think this was coming, he said almost defensively. I said nothing, because both of us knew that statement wasn't true. Daniel stood up from the table and walked toward the window, running a hand through his hair. The confidence he had walked in with earlier was gone, not entirely, but cracked. You're overreacting, he said after a moment. This doesn't change anything. He turned back toward me. The courts will still review everything. I expect they will, I said. Daniel stared at me for several seconds. Then he gave a short, humorless laugh. So, you think you outplayed me? I shook my head. No, I said quietly. That's not what this is. I stood up as well, sliding the folder of divorce papers back toward him across the table. This is just me protecting what's mine. Daniel looked down at the documents, then back at me. For the first time in 8 years of marriage, the balance between us felt different. Not explosive, not dramatic, just changed. And in the silence that followed, one thing became clear. The plan Daniel believed would leave me with nothing had already started to fall apart. Friday morning arrived colder than the rest of the week. Seattle's sky hung low and gray again, the kind of weather that made the city feel quieter than usual. I arrived at my studio just before 8, unlocking the glass door of Colin's interior studio and stepping inside the familiar scent of wood samples and fresh paint swatches. Normally, the space grounded me. It was where I built something that belonged entirely to me. But that morning, something felt off. Not immediately obvious, just a subtle shift in the air. My assistant, Claire Martinez, was already there organizing material samples on the long work table. Claire had been with the studio for 2 years. She was in her late 20s, sharp, dependable, and usually quick with a cheerful greeting. Today, she looked up from the table slowly. "Morning, Avery," she said. Her voice sounded careful. "Morning," I replied, setting my bag down. Claire hesitated for a moment before returning to her work. I noticed it again 30 minutes later during a call with a contractor. The conversation was polite but shorter than usual. The tone carried a distance that hadn't been there before. By mid-morning, the feeling had grown impossible to ignore. People were acting differently, not openly hostile, just cautious. Around 11, Claire knocked gently on my office door. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. I gestured for her to come in. She stepped inside, holding her tablet, her expression uneasy. "I wasn't sure if you'd seen this yet," she said. She placed the tablet on my desk and turned the screen toward me. It was a discussion thread from a local professional networking forum, one used by contractors, developers, and designers across the Seattle area. The headline caught my attention immediately. "Financial dispute involving local design firm." My stomach tightened as I read the post below it. Someone had written a detailed accusation claiming that an unnamed interior design business owner had moved company funds to avoid marital asset division during an upcoming divorce. The wording was careful, no direct name, but the details were specific enough that anyone familiar with the Seattle design community would understand exactly who the post referred to: me. A comment below the original post caught my eye. "Everyone in development circles knows who this is about." Another followed. "Colin's interior studio." The room felt suddenly smaller. Claire watched my face carefully. I didn't want to assume anything she said quietly, but people have been sharing it this morning. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Daniel. The realization settled in immediately. He hadn't attacked the legal structure I created, not directly. Instead, he had attacked something else. My reputation. The thread had already gathered dozens of replies. Some skeptical, some curious, and a few openly critical. In the design industry, reputation mattered almost as much as talent. Clients trusted you with their homes, their budgets, their private spaces, and once doubt appeared, it spread quickly. Claire shifted her weight nervously. "Do you want me to respond to it?" she asked. I shook my head slowly. "No." The word came out steadier than I expected, because even as anger rose in my chest, another realization followed close behind. Daniel wasn't trying to win a legal argument. He was trying to pressure me. If clients started hesitating, if projects slowed, if the business felt unstable, I might agree to a divorce settlement simply to stop the damage. It was a calculated move. And for the first time since Wednesday night, I felt the ground shift beneath my strategy. Protecting my assets had been the first step, but Daniel had just changed the battlefield. Claire watched me carefully. "What do we do?" she asked. I looked back at the screen. The accusations were still spreading, and for the first time since hearing Daniel's plan, I understood something clearly. This fight wasn't going to stay inside our house. It had just stepped into the rest of my life. I barely slept that Friday night. By the time Saturday morning arrived, I had already read the forum posts 3 more times each pass, making the same thing clearer. Daniel had been careful. He had not made a direct accusation under his own name. He had used suggestion, implication, and timing. It was enough to make people wonder. And in business, sometimes wonder did almost as much damage as proof. I drove to Portland before sunrise, the highway still quiet, the sky dark over the interstate. Marcus had asked me to bring everything connected to Collins Interior Studio client contracts, account summaries, design, invoices, tax records, and the digital archive I kept on an external drive in my office safe. When I arrived at his building a little after 10, he was already waiting in the conference room with a legal pad, a laptop, and 2 neatly stacked folders. "You look exhausted," he said gently. "I'm fine," I replied. It wasn't true, but neither of us had time to dwell on that. I set the banker's box of records on the table, along with the external drive and my laptop. Marcus pulled the materials toward him and started sorting them into categories with the kind of calm efficiency I had always admired. Before we talk strategy, he said we need to answer one question clearly. "Did you do anything that could be twisted into what he's describing?" I shook my head immediately. "No." Marcus nodded, but he still made me walk him through every transfer, every document, every sign change from the week before. Not because he doubted me, because if this turned into something formal, precision would matter more than emotion. For the next 2 hours, we reconstructed the entire sequence. The original incorporation of Collins Interior Studio before my marriage to Daniel, the business checking account tied to design revenue only, the contracts attached to current renovation projects, the ownership documentation for my design portfolio, including the digital plans, client concepts, and licensed materials my firm created. Then we reviewed the restructuring from earlier that week. Every transfer had a date. Every change had a purpose. Every signature matched a legal action tied to business protection, not concealment. Marcus tapped a line on one of the summaries. "Here," he said. I leaned forward. "This is what matters." The account in question had never received money from Daniel's real estate business, our household account, or any jointly held investment line. It was funded exclusively by design retainers, consulting fees, and direct project payments from my clients. "That means the central claim in the rumor collapses," Marcus said. "If the source of the funds is independent, the story he's pushing becomes much harder to sustain." I stared at the paperwork. The answer had been there the whole time. Daniel was betting on confusion, on the assumption that most people would never distinguish between marital finances and business revenue if the accusation sounded dramatic enough. Marcus opened one of the empty folders and began assembling copies. We document everything he said, not to argue online, not to chase gossip, to prepare for the moment this moves from whispers to something official. I felt my shoulders lower slightly for the first time since Claire placed that tablet on my desk. "So this isn't just defense," I said quietly. Marcus looked up at me. "No," he replied. "This is structure, and structure is what keeps panic from making mistakes." By late afternoon, we had built a clean record of every relevant transaction and every ownership document tied to my company. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was something more useful, a foundation. As I packed the files back into the box, Marcus stopped me. "One more thing," he said. I looked at him. "If Daniel was willing to start this publicly, don't assume he's finished." The room went still, because deep down I already knew that. And as I drove back towards Seattle under a fading gray sky, I understood that the next move in this fight would not be about money alone. It would be about who could make the truth hold long enough to outlast the lie. The first formal response arrived on Tuesday afternoon. By then, 3 more days had passed, and the rumors had done exactly what Daniel intended them to do. 2 prospective clients had postponed decisions on pending renovation contracts. One contractor, who had worked with my studio for years, sent a brief email saying he wanted to wait until things were clearer before committing to a new bid. Nothing had collapsed, but everything had slowed. That was Daniel's strategy, not a direct blow, a tightening pressure. Marcus called just after lunch. "It's moving," he said. "The attorney we looped in has reviewed the forum posts, the business records, and the sequence of events. We're filing a formal response and a demand for retraction." I stood in my office staring at the design boards on the wall. And if he refuses, I asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then this becomes discoverable, he said. And if it gets that far, he'll have to explain where his claims came from. That was the first moment I understood the risk Daniel had taken. He hadn't just spread gossip, he had built a public accusation around records that didn't support him. By Thursday morning, the pressure shifted. A copy of the formal legal notice had gone out to the site host, along with supporting documentation showing that Collins Interior Studios' accounts were independently funded and legally structured before Daniel filed for divorce. The same packet challenged the core implication that I had moved marital assets through company accounts. That afternoon, Claire stepped into my office again, but this time her expression was different. "People are talking," she said. I looked up from my desk. "In a good way." She nodded once. "Some of the developers who saw the original thread have seen the response too. They're asking where the accusation came from." I said nothing, because I knew where it came from. The question now was whether Daniel understood that the same ambiguity he had used against me was turning back toward him. By Friday, the thread had changed tone completely. Where there had once been speculation, there was now doubt. Several commenters questioned the timing. Others noted that the accusation never included verifiable records. A few openly suggested that someone had tried to weaponize divorce proceedings for leverage. No one said Daniel's name directly. They didn't have to. That evening, he called for the first time since serving the papers. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was clipped, stripped of the calm control he usually wore so well. "What exactly are you doing?" he asked. I sat at my kitchen table, one hand resting beside the closed folder that held copies of my business records. "I'm correcting the record," I said. "You're escalating this." "No," I replied quietly. "You did that when you tried to make my business pay for your divorce." There was silence on the line. Then I heard him exhale sharply. "You think this makes you look innocent?" I looked down at the folder. It wasn't innocence I cared about anymore. It was proof. It makes the truth visible, I said. He hung up without another word. On Monday, the site host removed the original thread pending further review. By noon, one of the clients who had paused her project called to say she wanted to move forward after all. An hour later, the contractor who had backed away sent another message asking if we could restart discussions. The damage wasn't gone, but the direction had changed, and somewhere inside that shift, the first real consequence landed where it belonged. Daniel had tried to stain my name in public. Instead, he had forced his own story into the light. He wasn't finished paying for that yet, but for the first time, I knew he would. 3 weeks later, the divorce hearing finally arrived. Tuesday morning in downtown Seattle carried that crisp, early autumn chill that makes the air feel sharper than usual. I walked into the courthouse just before 9, the same leather folder in my hand that had followed me through the last several weeks. Inside it were copies of everything that had carried me through the storm: the company records, the legal notices, the documentation Marcus had helped assemble piece by piece. Daniel was already seated when I entered the courtroom. For the first time since all of this began, he looked different. Not angry, not confident, just tired in a way I had never seen before. His attorney sat beside him quietly, flipping through a stack of papers. Marcus took the seat next to me. Neither of us spoke much. By that point, the facts were already clear. The forum accusations had been withdrawn formally after the host received the legal documentation. The attempt to imply financial misconduct had failed, but the hearing still mattered, because this was where the final structure of our separation would be decided. When the judge entered the room, settled quickly. The proceedings were straightforward. Daniel's attorney tried once to revisit the claim that business funds had been used to conceal marital assets. Marcus responded calmly, placing the financial records and ownership documentation in front of the court. Every timeline aligned. Every account origin was documented. Every signature matched the restructuring that protected my business. After reviewing the filings, the judge leaned back slightly. "The court finds no evidence that Collins Interior Studio assets constitute concealed marital property," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of weeks. Daniel said nothing. The ruling finalized the separation terms shortly afterward. My business remained fully independent. The restructuring of my assets stood exactly as it had been filed. And with that, the last thread Daniel had tried to pull unraveled quietly. When we stepped out into the courthouse hallway, he approached me once more. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "You didn't have to make this so difficult." I looked at him carefully. For years, I had trusted that voice, the calm tone, the careful phrasing, but something inside me had changed. "No," I replied. "You made it difficult the moment you tried to take something that wasn't yours." He didn't argue. He simply nodded once and walked away down the corridor. That was the last time I saw him. Life didn't suddenly transform after that day. The studio still had projects waiting. Clients still needed design plans. Claire still arrived early every morning with her tablet and her quiet determination. But the tension that had lived under everything for weeks slowly faded. One afternoon, not long afterward, I walked through the studio alone after closing. Sunlight was coming through the tall windows, lighting up the material boards along the wall. For the first time in months, the room felt exactly like it used to. Not like a battleground, just a place where something could be built. I realized then that revenge had never really been the point. Protection had been. And once the truth had enough room to stand on its own, everything else simply settled into place. Peace doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it shows up quietly the moment you realize no one else controls the direction of your life anymore. If this story reminded you of the strength it takes to protect your future, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this often help others realize they're not alone. And if you'd like to hear more journeys about justice, resilience, and rebuilding life after betrayal, consider subscribing and watching the next story waiting for you.